Hello, everybody. We're nearing the end of the week, and I thought this is the right time to talk to you about the developments in the actual peace process between Russia and the United States. And even though Western media is trying to trash talk what is happening at the moment, I think the what we get out of Washington and Moscow, and even out of Kiev, tells us that the peace process is very much in progress, despite all of the efforts of the Europeans to derail what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin here are trying to set up. So let me explain this to you by virtue of looking at three newspaper pieces that we recently got. I think if we juxtapose those, we get a quite interesting overview of where the interpretations and the ideologies of this war lie as we speak today on this May 22nd, 2025. The first piece is this one here, by the New York Times, and I don't hold the New York Times in very high esteem, but it's always a good paper to check because there you get the official narrative. You understand what is officially sayable and what not. And the interpretation at the moment is that the polite society agrees that Trump has a new position on the Ukraine war. Not my problem. So this apparently is new. I mean, apparently, according to the New York Times, Mr. Trump so far took ownership of the war and of support for Ukraine, and now he seems to be walking away. So on the one hand, the actual analysis here is not too bad. I mean, Mr. Trump is threatening to walk away from the entire project Ukraine, but the way this is portrayed is of course a farce because Donald Trump for the longest time has been trying, at least half-heartedly, on the one hand he has been trying to brand this as Biden's war and brand it as something that should never have started and would never have started had he been in power. He never gets tired of saying that. On the other hand, of course, he made things that I and others interpret as mistakes when he listened too closely to some of his hawkish advisors like Rubio and Hexeth instead of the more realistic faction of his cabinet like Witkoff and certainly also go Tulsi Gabbard. And whenever he has been coming too close to the European line, he kind of burned or he ran the danger of burning himself. But as it seems now, what we've seen from the phone call that happened on Monday, when the two leaders actually talked, he's been walking away from that fire, and this is quite significant. So the article in the New York Times continues its framing somewhere further down by quoting a former U.S. ambassador, Bridget A. Brink. I mean, she doesn't matter, but she put it in a way which I think exemplifies how the West currently sees everything unfolding. She says, quote, "The policy since the beginning of the Trump administration has been to put pressure on the victim, Ukraine, rather than the aggressor, Russia. Peace at any price is not peace at all. It is appeasement." This is, of course, another one of these horrible statements in order to justify prolonging the war and in order to justify throwing even more escalatory actions around by the White House. And the Biden administration has been using this for the entire 3 years of the war, right? That we will not appease Vladimir Putin and we will not even talk to them, right? We will not even open negotiations and discussions. Let's not forget, negotiations are only happening now in the new Trump administration. So this is, of course, this one school of thought in the United States that, for propagandistic reasons, but also for ideology, just wants to double down, right? The entire framing here is that we haven't done enough yet, right? We should not hold back. We should put more pressure, even though the pressure of the last 3 years, including the sanctions and especially all of the military aid and basically throwing everything at the kitchen sink into the battlefield, hasn't actually worked. But these people here, they still think we should just escalate more. If we do more war, then we get to peace. And if anyone says we want to get to peace through negotiations, then that's appeasement because you're giving in to evil. right? That's the mindset, and that's also the framing that the New York Times here uses in order to explain the failings, what all the things that Trump is doing wrong at the moment. And of course, on this one here, I think Trump is actually quite right in doing what he does. But let's see here. There, further down, there's another interesting passage in which the New York Times article says that Mr. Trump implied in his public comments that his call with Mr. Putin had resulted in a breakthrough of sorts, but it quickly became clear to the Ukrainians and Europeans that the Russian leader had made no concessions to Mr. Trump beyond negotiating. Russia is already doing that, albeit half-heartedly, sending a junior team to Istanbul last week for talks with the Ukrainians. Now, why does this matter? This matters because, on the one hand, it's absolute BS. The people that the Kremlin send is not a junior team, and I will show you later who they sent. They sent skilled negotiators, the people who already were involved in the negotiations in 2022, and a high-ranking delegation of people who are experts in their fields. So trash talking them as a junior team really only makes sense if you think that peace negotiations only happen between presidents of countries, right? Because Mr. Zelensky went to Istanbul, right? Begrudgingly, he didn't want to go, but in the end, he traveled to Turkey. Actually, he didn't show up in Istanbul. Sorry, he went to Ankara. I correct myself. He went to Ankara to meet with Erdogan, and then his team went to Istanbul. I mean, he himself didn't take part in these negotiations, but his team did. So the point, of course, the framing that these people wanted to impose on us over the last couple of weeks is that Putin is not willing to negotiate, despite the fact that um, the idea or the proposal for these negotiations in Istanbul itself came, of course, from Vladimir Putin in a nightly talk of his, and he said as a counter proposal to what the Europeans said, and I'll talk about that in a second. He is the one who said, like, let's negotiate. But of course, in the Western framing, in the New York Times framing, and so on, you still need to keep up the appearance that Vladimir Putin, you cannot negotiate with him. You cannot negotiate with the Russians, right? So the trick that they're using now is to say that because he didn't go himself to Turkey as Mr. Zelensky did, that shows that he's a bad faith actor, and that's of course a lot of BS, and it's utter propaganda. Um, it must also be said, like the entire, again, the fact that there are talks, that there are actual negotiations, that is something that we never had under the Biden administration ever after they sabotaged the 2022 Istanbul negotiations, right? So the entire spinning of the New York Times, but what we need to understand, it's not just the New York Times, this is the Western framework to understand what's happening. The entire framing is that nothing has changed. Mr. Putin is still a warmonger. Russia doesn't want negotiations. Russia is bloodthirsty and wants to conquer all of Ukraine. And now Trump seems to be abandoning Ukraine, right? But that is not what is happening. What is happening is a peace process. And I will not get tired of emphasizing this. Peace is not struck overnight over like a 30-minute phone call. Peace is just like war. It needs preparation. It needs building up. In this case, not of troops. What it needs is building up of understanding, of trust, of teamwork, actually, across the aisle, across the battlefield, in order to get to something. And it seems to me, the longer I look at this, that of course, Mr. Putin understands very clearly what this is about, and Mr. Trump seems to understand it too, at least so it seems this week. If you want to get a better interpretation of what's happening, then we should actually go and compare what the New York Times article said with a Russia Today article. And don't forget, in the European Union, it is forbidden to broadcast Russia Today. So what I'm doing here, showing you a Russia Today article, actually breaks with the rules of the European Union. But luckily, I'm a Swiss citizen, not part of the European Union, and I'm living in Japan, not part of the European Union. And in both countries, accessing Russia Today is still very much possible. There are still some free countries, even within the unfree West. But this article here, written by Mr. Sergei Poletaev, really gives us a little bit of clarity on the entire strategy of the process. So, of course, the Russians from their end, they put their spin on it with the wording and so on. Putin ends the charade. Trump call puts brakes on West's diplomatic offensive. And he points out something important in this article, which is that it was, of course, the Europeans and the Ukrainians who tried to sabotage the US-Russian rapprochement in order to get to an end of the war, because both of them, Kiev and Brussels, they still want to push on, and the thing is they don't want to push their own troops into the battlefield. They want to push NATO and especially the United States. They want the backing of the United States because they are aware that they themselves are weak little chicken that could barely stand up to for a month on one of these battlefields. They're weak little chicken. And the United States, that's the mother goose. And you need the mother goose in order to do this. Mr. Poletaev, he writes that what's unfolding is not just a conversation about peace, but a broader contest over influence and strategic direction. Competing visions of how the conflict should end or be managed are colliding in real time. Western Europe is scrambling to maintain relevance, Ukraine is caught between urgency and uncertainty, and Trump, now at the center of this geopolitical tug of war, is being courted by both sides. Um, this is very well put. This is just very well put. Um, the factions are now pretty clear, and the question is which one will win over Donald Trump? Because at the end of the day, the might of the United States matters in this game of military power, right? And economic coercive power, and the whole goal, it seems at the moment, of the Russian and the US leader are to come to an understanding that they can then push down on the others and make them swallow a bitter pill that they don't want to. Let me continue with the article. This leaves the Western Europeans with just one real move: convince Trump back to their agenda, boxing him in to a policy that isn't his own. And you can see very clearly how this has been playing out over the last couple of weeks, how the Europeans have been trying to lay one trap after another. For instance, this call for a 30-day ceasefire, which the Russians said from the beginning they are not going to do because that's they've tried this long enough with Minsk and so on. They said we will negotiate, but we will negotiate while the battlefield continues being the battlefield. So especially like we're the winning party. We're not going to seize our opportunity on the battlefield in order to be misled by you guys again. So they made that very, very clear, and the Europeans, of course, understand this. And then the Europeans said, so you need to accept the 30-day ceasefire without conditions, otherwise it's going to be more sanctions. And they even managed to convince Trump to, at certain points on Truth Social and in some of his speech acts, to almost kind of go along and say, yeah, we need, I would put sanctions if Russia was not honest. And this was then immediately interpreted by the Europeans as having won over Trump and continue pushing Trump into this corner in which, out of his own rhetoric, he's then obliged to follow up. But he has been avoiding that also by reversing course at some points. I mean, Mr. Trump, in this case, luckily says a lot of things at a lot of times, and then changes his mind. And once it's changed, then he might go down that route, which also makes him unpredictable. But it makes him also unpredictable for the peace process. But it is in this case that he went back and backtracked on some of these threats of his own is in this case a good thing. So when the Europeans then said we want a 30-day ceasefire without preconditions, and then we start negotiations, America, you have to support us in this. Trump was silent, and then last week, Vladimir Putin made this brilliant move and said, like, look, I'm inviting you to Istanbul. I'm inviting you to Istanbul to come and do the negotiations, right? And here the article says Putin made his counter move. He publicly invited Kiev to resume direct peace talks in Istanbul. And actually, at this point, the United States, Donald Trump said he expects Mr. Zelensky to attend this, and he expects the Ukrainians to go. So he put pressure on the Ukrainians, although they said they wouldn't want to do that, and the Europeans were shocked and said like, but ceasefire first. But they reversed that. Mr. Putin managed to reverse that order and said, no, talks first, and then during the talks we will discuss a ceasefire. So with that offer, the Russian president, says the article, set the terms of negotiations himself. Yes, he actually reversed. He undercut the Europeans in their attempt to win over Trump, and he did this in a very public fashion. And secondly, he also completely sidelined Western Europe with this, because at the actual negotiations, you of course only have Ukrainians and Russians present. There's no space for the Europeans. There was no space for the Europeans at the table. And in the direct phone conversation with Mr. Trump on Monday, of course, the Europeans weren't part of this again. So very intelligent move actually of Putin and of Trump to play the ball amongst themselves and just manage Ukraine, right, while keeping out the Europeans, because the Europeans at every single turn they try to derail this project. Mr. I keep forgetting his name, sorry. Poletaev. Mr. Poletaev then also says there's some diplomatic trolling involved in this move, because Vladimir Putin called the Ukrainians to come to the exact place in Istanbul where they walked away from in 2022. I don't interpret it as trolling. Actually, if you look at Mr. Putin's actions of the last 3 years, what he has done is he has consistently kept the negotiation outcome, the papers that we now know. He kept that secret for the longest time. I think it was the New York Times that somehow got some copies of the final version and published that. But Mr. Putin never published it. The Russians never published it. He showed it several times and he said, "We have these negotiations. This is what we have. This is what we have, and we should get back to it." He said that several times, and he just keeps he's just consistent actually with what he's been saying over the last 3 years. It has been very clear to me that he even way into the special military operation, into this war, he always kept referring to Istanbul, and not just as a way to justify what is happening. He kept using it as a point that you could go back to, that this is the most we've already worked out, and we can see that now after 3 years, this strategy bears fruit. That he actually says, like, look, we just go back to what we already had and then continue negotiating there, and we negotiate it in the same manner. And here, this is where this article actually sets the record straight. Russia sent a relatively heavyweight delegation to Istanbul. The head of the military intelligence, top deputies from the foreign and defense ministries, and a cadre of seasoned experts. So all the people the technocrats who are capable and who are knowledgeable about the details that need to be hammered out, or that need to be continued to hammered out and adjusted from what you left off in 2022. And in fact, the good news that came out of these discussions here was that the talks were more substantive than expected, because both sides actually called it somehow constructive, or at least they didn't leave the negotiations. And you had 1,000 prisoners that will be exchanged from both sides, 1,000 for 1,000. So this is a typical thing that happens in early stage negotiations, that you try to work from the topics that are easy to solve, where you obviously both of you have a common interest. And a prisoner exchange is one. Exchange of the deceased is another one. Both sides have an interest to get their people back, right? And if you offer something from your side, you will very likely get it from the other side, because it's a low-level concession for both sides. It's a low-level concession, and it's easy to do this, and then you build up from there. It's also called trust building, right? Over time, in order to get to the more substantive parts, until you get to the core of the issues at the very top level, which for this war we've also been told repeatedly by the Russians is neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO membership, no threats at the border, and the denazification, so the purging of the ultra-right-wing elements from Ukraine's political process, right? I mean, we know all of that. This has been on the table for 3 years, but these are the contentious parts. So you start with the the easy ones. Um, The articles also says that curiously, Western Europe wasn't invited to the Istanbul talks at all. No EU officials were in Turkey. The ultimatums issued days earlier ignored by Moscow and by Washington. So this is really the important part the that Trump didn't follow up on anything the Europeans threatened because he luckily seems to understand that the Europeans 100% depend on what he and what Washington does. So the thing that he has to be most careful of is that they don't push him into a corner that he doesn't want to be in. And we leave it at this in this article here. I think again, if you actually want to get a proper overview of what is happening, you definitely need to compare these different analyses because the honestly, like the New York Times article is not garbage, but is a ton and a ton of framing in there, whereas the RT article here really tries to get into the nitty gritty and understands especially the power play between these different actors with different interests, obviously different interests. The Europeans at the moment, if you look at the Guardian for a moment, they are they are very scared. They're very scared that this that Project Ukraine is not working out the way they would want it to. They frame it as a problem of unity, European unity against Putin in peril if Trump moves to ease sanctions. This is the next step, of course, like that they are afraid of that the Trump administration might instead of doubling down on the sanctions, might start relaxing them, which would be the ultimate sign that there is now a superpower understanding between Washington and Moscow, which they couldn't obstruct anymore. The article says European hopes that Donald Trump might increase the pressure on the Kremlin were dashed after the US president's 2 hours inconclusive phone call with Mr. Putin on Monday. Yes, that is true. These hopes were dashed, and it's good that they were dashed because these hopes are hopes to prolong the war and to keep fighting, which is obviously what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin both said. What they want to come to an end. And the difference is that Mr. Trump also still thinks that a ceasefire is necessary at this point, whereas Mr. Putin says, no, we are not going to be fooled again. We'll continue with the battlefield, and we come to an agreement first, and then we stop, and not the other way around. And this is taken by the Europeans as an argument to continue the arming and to increase and escalate the war on their side. For Europe, the question is, what next? This week, the EU approves its 17th round of sanctions against Russia. This is quite, I mean, it's getting funnier and funnier. The Europeans, like, if 1, 2, 3, or 4 sanction packages don't do anything, certainly the 17th will. Let me read you this part. It also said it had imposed the largest ever package targeting Putin's shadow fleet, poorly maintained tankers using flags of convenience that enable Russia to sell oil to countries such as India in defiance of Western restrictions. The Europeans keep coming back to this because it is so dear to their heart that they even though they don't have the military capacity, they really try very hard economically, and it's working. Kaya Kallas says it's working. You know, the Russian economy is at the brink of collapse. The last 3 years, they've been telling us that the Russians are at the brink of collapse. I mean, it's at this point, it's pathetic. It's just pathetic. It was laughable. It was something to look at and evaluate if it's true the first year. Then it was kind of laughable in the second year, and now the third year it's just pathetic that they still cling to this fantasy because the Russian economy is doing well on all fronts, and it's actually you know the Russians, especially their military industry is booming, and their economic progress is going forward. I mean, even the World Bank data shows that the Russians are doing fine. So this is just insane. The targeting of the oil and gas at the beginning had an impact, made a dent in the Russian economy, but they figured out how to do it, and the way to do it is to deal with others. And the Europeans at this point, especially also this article is a good example. You know, they still try to frame as if though the Russians are doing something illegal. You know, a shadow fleet. A shadow fleet is not any form of official naming convention in international trade. It is not a naming convention in international diplomacy. It's not a naming convention or any kind of legal concept. This is simply a stupid spinning of vessels on the high sea that do trade that the Europeans would want not to see. But the point is, it's trade between third states. These tankers transport oil from Russia to places like India, to countries that want to buy Russian oil, and the Europeans have no right to interfere in that trade in what manner whatsoever. The only right they have, sovereign right, is to forbid imports of Russian oil and gas into their own territory. That's their right. They can do that. And they can put these sanctions, which is like, we will not buy from you. We will not give you our money. We will not take your oil. That's their right. But telling third states that they're not allowed to trade with Russia in things that have nothing to do with the European Union, that's not their right. They still try to do it, and they call this secondary sanctions. But secondary sanctions are a very draconic measure, and they can fire back big time. And the only way to sell this uh, to the European general public is by framing it as Russia still doing something illegal. They are not doing anything illegal. The European Union trying to put sanctions on the vessels of other states to prevent them from doing deals with the Russians. That's the illegal thing. And I must say, the way that the Europeans tried this at the beginning is by working with their structural power on insurances. They basically, all of the large ship insurance companies, the reinsuring companies, the largest ones, they're all in the United States, all in Europe, mostly in the UK, and some in the United States. The ones that insure these tankers, because these tankers are worth billions of US dollars, right? So you need to insure them in order to make a viable business case and make this safe for traders. And by forbidding these reinsurance companies to insure these tankers, that's how they put pressure and thought that they could impede and completely cripple all of Russia's all of the tankers that would transport oil from Russia to other states. But it didn't work because Russia figured out its own reinsurance system. BRICS worked on reinsurance systems, and they got tankers and they got a fleet together that is actually willing and able to transport all of this oil, and they're allowed to do so in international law and international waters. They can travel freely. That's their good right under international law. And here the Europeans are so angry that the Russians found a way around. That the Russians didn't just sit back and capitulate, but that they found a way around of this pressure. Um, the article then also keeps talking. The Europeans keep talking about energy because this is very dear to them. That the funniest thing here is, of course, that the Guardian says, the Europeans are now thinking about putting also sanctions on Nord Stream related businesses to dissuade any investors from trying to bring back one of these pipelines between Russia and Germany, because there are some talks in the back. And they're also saying Nord Stream 1 was rendered unusable after a series of underwater blasts for which no one has ever claimed responsibility. I was like, say, wow, you guys are really good at framing. You're as You should have said, which nobody ever bothered investigating, or you should have said, which the Swedes and the Danes and the Germans decided not to publish the investigation of. It's not only that nobody claimed responsibility, it's that the Europeans, officially buried this because it is utterly clear by now that this was an inside job, if not by NATO, then by countries affiliated by NATO member states in one way or another. But this is still buried under, and still needs to remain buried for many, many years, right? Until it can be a footnote to history what actually happened. But they go back to this. So the Europeans are scared. The article says that Ukraine is arguing for sanctions on foreign countries that buy Russian oil, according to leaked documents from Kiev seen by Reuters, which was reported on Wednesday. Such secondary sanctions, which could hit large importers such as China and India, would be a significant step. This again is like where these articles are plainly dumb, because There would be a significant step. You would shoot yourself significantly in the foot. Do you really think that, that China and India would just sit back and accept that the Europeans put sanctions on them for dealing with a friendly Russia, friendly to them, which they have no beef with and with which they have been already saying many times they are friendly with, and they want nothing to do with this war. If you put secondary sanctions on these countries, they will retaliate, and it will make everything worse for you. So, the European Union now trying to throw around its weight implies that it has weight, but its weight is diminishing every single week. Um, it's just sad at this point. So of course this is the dream of these people who have no clue about the actual power distribution now in the system. But this is what I want to point out. Again, I think Mr. Pol Pol Poletaev, Mr. Poletaev got it absolutely right when he analyzes the situation that at the moment Western Europe is scrambling to maintain relevance. Ukraine is caught between urgency and uncertainty, and Trump, now at the center of this geopolitical tug of war, is being courted by both sides. And as it looks to me, they are still trying to maintain the peace process, Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, and they're working themselves now through these different stages necessary in order to get to an understanding, basically terms of surrender for Ukraine that they then also can enforce and make Ukraine accept in one way or another. What it will be is unclear, especially the territorial question is anything but resolved. There is I do not think that the Russians will give in very much on their demands. The only thing that I can imagine that the Russians might do is to rethink their demand on the territories that they do not yet, the territories beyond the Dnieper, which they do not yet physically control, although according to the Russian constitution, those territories are already part of Russia. But that is the only place where I see any kind of room for territorial negotiations from the Russian side, although it must be said if Vladimir Putin did that, then it might significantly anger his own constituency and his own also his own military. So maybe not, but somewhere there, somewhere around the Dnieper lies a room for negotiation. You could also think of models of outside UN peacekeepers in the territories beyond the Dnieper that are part of Zaporozhye and Kherson and so on, that would then figure as a buffer zone and would be claimed by both sides, something like that. But in order to get to this level of hammering out details, you need to first move beyond the level of obstruction. And the fact, again, that Vladimir Putin was the one who was able to open negotiations, we must take note of that. That he managed to turn around the approach by the Europeans to win over Trump, and in turn managed to get negotiations going. So is this a clear sign that the war will end soon? No, I don't think so. We are still, though, in a hopeful state, at least at the moment. As long as Donald Trump avoids being sucked in by the Europeans into their shenanigans to become a tool of the Europeans to put pressure on Russia, as long as that's averted, the peace process can continue, because the process that the Europeans are aiming for, and by the way, also in the Trump administration, Mr. Kellogg with his 22-point plan, that's not a peace plan. That is a recipe for the continuation of the war, because the Russians have already made it sufficiently clear that what's in these 22 points, that was what Kellogg proposes, and start with a ceasefire first and then basically force Russia to capitulate. That is, of course, not acceptable to the Russians. So Mr. Trump needs to avoid this one. If he does, he might exert his power and he might bring it out. He might throw around the weight of the US in order to get Russia to concede something in return for then jointly cracking down on Ukraine while completely sidelining Europe. And again, the saddest part of this is the Europeans because they are not only playing the very sad role of spoiler. They are at this point a spoiler. They are trying to very much to spoil the process as much as they can. They are also the weak little chicken in the corner that really that at this point is really just a nuisance. And it's very sad to see that for something, especially the European Union, that used to pride itself of being a peace project. Okay, I will leave you with this. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll do an update again in the near future. Bye.